The village of Willowbrook lay in a shallow green valley where the hedgerows were thick, the church clock occasionally unreliable, and everybody knew precisely how many teaspoons of sugar everybody else took in their tea. It was the sort of village where scandal rarely arrived dramatically. It seeped instead through half-open garden gates, over cups of tea, beneath lowered voices in the High Street bakery. A late return home could occupy conversation for a week. An unpaid bill at the butcher's might become village legend, and on the afternoon of the Willowbrook Parish summer fete, nothing whatsoever appeared likely to disturb the ancient peace of things. The fete occupied the grounds of Hawthorne Lodge, a gracious Georgian house belonging to Colonel Arthur Penrith and his unmarried sister Lavinia. White bunting fluttered from hedges and windowsills. Tables had been arranged upon the lawn beneath striped awnings. The brass band from Much Benham played cheerful marches with more enthusiasm than precision. Children ran shrieking past croquet hoops. Elderly ladies arranged sponge cakes with military concentration. The scent of roses mingled pleasantly with cucumber sandwiches and freshly cut grass. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath a pale parasol beside the tea-table, knitting something soft and blue. She appeared entirely occupied with counting stitches. Very few people in Willowbrook ever understood how much Miss Marple observed, while appearing not to observe at all. From where she sat she could see nearly the entire lawn. She noticed Mrs. Bellamy, the vicar's wife, pretending not to watch Mrs. Cresswell's new hat. She noticed young Peter Fawcett slipping coins from his mother's handbag for the coconut shy. She noticed Lavinia Penrith smiling too brightly whenever anyone mentioned finances, and she noticed, too, a curious exchange beside the old rose arbor. Miss Evelyn Harbury stood there with Dr. Leonard Graves. Evelyn Harbury was not, strictly speaking, a villager. She had arrived only 8 months earlier after inheriting Briar Cottage from an elderly aunt. She was handsome in a dark, striking way uncommon in Willowbrook, black hair, clear, pale skin, and eyes that seemed always slightly amused. The village had never entirely decided what to make of her. Some considered her charming. Others considered her dangerous. Miss Marple, who believed that excessive charm was often as revealing as bad manners, reserved judgment. At that moment Evelyn stood very still while Dr. Graves spoke in a low, tense voice. "You cannot possibly imagine," he said sharply, "that this can continue." Evelyn's expression did not alter. "My dear Leonard," she replied softly, "everything continues. That is the unpleasant thing about life." Dr. Graves glanced nervously toward the fete. Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. "Someone may hear," he muttered. "Then perhaps," said Evelyn, "you ought not to say alarming things." The doctor moved away abruptly, nearly colliding with a tray of lemonade carried by a girl guide. Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully upon Evelyn Harbury. Then the brass band struck up loudly, and Mrs. Bellamy descended upon Miss Marple with tea. "My dear Miss Marple, do try the seed cake before Major Fanshawe consumes all of it. Men are astonishing at fetes. They behave exactly like escaped livestock." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said. "Human nature is very consistent." By 4:30 the fete had reached its happiest point. The raffle tickets had nearly sold out. Children clustered around the pond for the toy boat competition. Colonel Penrith was loudly explaining wartime bridge engineering to people who had not asked. Inside the drawing-room of Hawthorne Lodge, an exhibition of historical village items had been arranged upon velvet-covered tables. Old letters, silverware, lace on velvet-covered tables. Old letters, silverware, lace collars, and embroidered household objects from former centuries. Among these items stood a curious sewing basket made of dark woven willow with a faded silk lining. A handwritten card identified it as "Sewing basket belonging to Eliza Marchmont, 1891. Miss Marple paused before it while others drifted casually past. "A rather melancholy object," she murmured. Mrs. Bellamy blinked. "Melancholy?" "Why?" "Well," said Miss Marple, "sewing baskets often are. They contain all sorts of patient things, mending, waiting, domestic anxieties. Women used to sew while enduring disappointments." Mrs. Bellamy laughed uncertainly. "You always say the most curious things." Miss Marple bent slightly nearer. Inside the basket lay embroidery scissors, faded threads, and several pieces of unfinished needlework. And there, almost hidden beneath a fold of linen, she noticed something peculiar. A faint dark stain. Very old, perhaps nothing at all. Yet Miss Marple's eyes lingered. Behind her, voices rose suddenly in the hallway. "Has anyone seen Evelyn? That woman is impossible to keep track of. I thought she went toward the conservatory." Miss Marple straightened slowly. Something in the tone too sharp, too hurried disturbed her. Then came the scream. It was not a theatrical scream, nor prolonged. It was short, raw, and genuinely terrified. The entire drawing-room froze. For one suspended moment nobody moved. Then chairs scraped violently backward and people hurried toward the conservatory doors. Miss Marple remained seated for precisely 2 seconds longer than anyone else. Excitement, she always believed, caused people to overlook things. When she rose, she quietly observed that Dr. Graves had turned completely pale, and that Lavinia Penrith, though trembling, looked less shocked than frightened. The conservatory smelled strongly of damp earth and crushed geranium leaves. Evelyn Harbury lay upon the tiled floor beside a wrought iron plant stand. The position of the body suggested collapse rather than violence. One hand remained curled near her throat. Her dark hair spread untidily across the tiles. A porcelain teacup lay shattered nearby. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Mrs. Bellamy whispered,
"Oh, merciful heaven!"
Dr. Graves pushed through the crowd immediately, dropping to his knees beside the body. The silence deepened. Miss Marple watched his face carefully. Not grief, very considerable fear. At last he stood slowly. "She's dead," he announced. The villagers began speaking all at once. "A seizure? She was perfectly well earlier. Fetch the police." "How dreadful!" Colonel Penrith attempted command. "Everybody remain calm. Stand back, please, stand back." But calm was impossible now. Panic moved invisibly among them. Miss Marple looked down quietly at the broken teacup. A faint almond scent lingered in the air. Her expression altered almost imperceptibly. Beside her, Major Fanshawe muttered, "Bad business, very bad business," Miss Marple said softly. Then, after a pause, "Especially when poison is involved," the Major stared. "Poison?" But Miss Marple had already fallen silent again. The police arrived from Much Benham shortly after 6 o'clock. Inspector Harold Finch was a practical man with an excellent moustache and a deep distrust of village dramatics. He had solved numerous thefts, disputes, and one memorable incident involving forged ration coupons. Murder at a parish fete, however, clearly displeased him profoundly. The conservatory was cleared. Statements were taken. Villagers gathered in anxious clusters across the lawn as dusk crept slowly over Willowbrook. Miss Marple sat quietly beside the hydrangeas, knitting once more. Inspector Finch approached her eventually with the respectful caution policemen often adopted toward elderly women who seemed harmless but were not. "You were present, Miss Marple?" "Yes." "You noticed anything unusual?" Miss Marple considered. "Well, she said many things are unusual when looked at properly." The inspector suppressed a sigh. "Yes, but anything specifically relevant?" "My experience," said Miss Marple gently, "is that nearly everything becomes relevant eventually." Inspector Finch removed his notebook with resignation. "Let us begin at the beginning." Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully. "The beginning," she said, "usually occurs much earlier than people think. And beyond the darkening windows of Hawthorne Lodge, unnoticed by everyone, the old sewing-basket remained upon its velvet-covered table, waiting silently. By 9 o'clock that evening, Willowbrook had divided itself into 3 distinct camps. The first camp believed the death of Evelyn Harbury to be an unfortunate accident. The second believed it to be suicide. The third, by far the largest and most energetic, believed it to be murder, and had already formed at least 7 separate theories concerning the culprit. In villages, conclusions ripened with astonishing speed. Miss Marple, seated beside the fire in her small sitting room at Rosebank Cottage, listened patiently while her friend Mrs. Elspeth Carter delivered the latest developments with breathless urgency. "My dear Jane, you cannot imagine the atmosphere. Perfectly dreadful. Everyone talking at once. And naturally the police are keeping things secret, which only makes people more certain they know everything." Mrs. Carter removed her gloves dramatically. "And between ourselves, I do not trust that Dr. Graves in the least." Miss Marple poured tea carefully. "Sougain?" "1 lump, thank you. Though really I scarcely know how one is expected to digest anything after such an afternoon." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People generally do digest things," she observed. "Even shocks. Human beings are remarkably adaptable." Mrs. Carter accepted her tea. "Well, perhaps, but everyone says the poor woman was poisoned. And Inspector Finch questioned nearly everybody before allowing them to leave. That is sensible." Mrs. Carter lowered her voice. "There is more." Miss Marple waited. "They say Dr. Graves and Evelyn Harbury were having an affair." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. Do they? It explains everything, does it not? He looked absolutely ghastly after her death, and Mrs. Graves has always seemed such a cold woman. Cold people, said Miss Marple thoughtfully, often suffer far more deeply than emotional ones. They simply do not perform it publicly. Mrs. Carter blinked. Well, perhaps, though I still say there was something odd about Evelyn Harbury from the beginning. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Outside, rain tapped gently against the cottage windows. The village lane beyond lay silver-black beneath the moonlight. At last she said, Do you know, Elspeth, people frequently mistake confidence for wickedness in women, particularly attractive women. Mrs. Carter looked mildly disappointed. You do not think badly of her? I did not know her sufficiently well. But surely you notice things? Miss Marple smiled. My dear Elspeth, I always notice things. The difficulty is deciding which things matter. The following morning dawned grey and damp. By 8:30, Inspector Finch had established a temporary office inside the library at Hawthorne Lodge. Colonel Penrith objected strongly to police mud upon his carpets, but was overruled by necessity. The inspector sat reviewing statements with growing dissatisfaction. The medical findings had confirmed poison, cyanide, administered in tea, which transformed the affair from unfortunate tragedy into unmistakable murder. Unfortunately, it also transformed nearly every guest at the fete into a possible suspect. Sergeant Pollard entered carrying fresh notes. More statements, sir? Finch grunted. Any consistency among them? Very little, though half the village insists the doctor was intimate with the dead woman. Inspector Finch frowned. Village gossip. Yes, sir. Usually exaggerated. Yes, sir. Unfortunately often accurate. The sergeant coughed discreetly. There's something else, sir. Finch looked up. Miss Harbury received a letter yesterday morning. From whom? No signature. Housemaid found part of it burned in the grate at Briar Cottage. Anything legible? The sergeant handed him an evidence envelope. Finch read the surviving fragment. You can't hide it any more. Then lower down. After what happened? And finally. Inspector Finch's eyebrows rose. The basket? Yes, sir. Finch leaned back slowly. What basket? At approximately the same hour, Miss Marple was visiting the village post office under the entirely reasonable pretext of purchasing stamps. The Willowbrook post office possessed the village's greatest strategic advantage. Everyone passed through it eventually. Miss Marple selected postcards while listening quietly. Two farmers discussed fertilizer. Mrs. Bellamy whispered scandalously near the biscuit tins. And young Miss Lydia Trent, assistant to the solicitor Mr. Phelps, remarked to the postmistress. Apparently Inspector Finch questioned Dr. Graves for over an hour. Mrs. Wainwright, the postmistress, widened her eyes. Dear me, they say he argued with Miss Harbury shortly before she died. Miss Marple purchased 6 stamps. As she turned toward the door, she encountered Lavinia Penrith entering hurriedly. Miss Marple noticed immediately that Lavinia looked exhausted. Her gloves were mismatched, a tiny thing but revealing. People in control of themselves rarely wore mismatched gloves. My dear Miss Marple, Lavinia said nervously. What dreadful weather. Yes, said Miss Marple. Rain often makes people uneasy. Lavinia gave a strained laugh. I suppose the whole village is talking of nothing except yesterday. That is inevitable. Lavinia hesitated. Then, quite suddenly, You don't think Arthur had anything to do with it? Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. Your brother? Yeah. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but the inspector kept asking questions about finances. Were Colonel Penrith's finances troubling him? A faint flush rose in Lavinia's cheeks. Everyone has financial worries nowadays. Indeed. And Evelyn knew certain things. Miss Marple said quietly, What sort of things? Lavinia's composure faltered for a moment. Then she recovered it. Oh, nothing important. I am being foolish. But she departed without purchasing anything. Miss Marple watched the door close behind her. Then she bought 2 more stamps she did not need. People frequently revealed more while leaving than while arriving. That afternoon Inspector Finch called upon Miss Marple. He found her in the garden deadheading roses. Ah, Inspector, she said pleasantly. You are very welcome. Finch removed his hat. I hope I am not disturbing you. Not at all. Though roses do dislike interruption. The inspector accepted tea on the lawn with the slightly trapped expression of a man who knew he was about to receive observations he did not entirely want. After preliminary conversation concerning weather, begonias, and village drains, Finch produced his notebook. I understand, he said, that you noticed something about the teacup yesterday. Miss Marple nodded. The scent of bitter almonds. Quite. Finch paused. Most people would not recognize cyanide. But many years ago a girl employed at a guest house in Bournemouth poisoned herself after an unfortunate love affair. Very sad. One never entirely forgets such smells. The inspector shifted. There is another matter. Yes? The inspector shifted. There is another matter. Yes? A burned letter was discovered mentioning something called the basket. Does that phrase mean anything to you? Miss Marple folded her hands. In villages, Inspector, objects are very often more important than they appear. Finch sighed inwardly. Yes, but specifically? The sewing basket displayed at Hawthorne Lodge interested me. Why? It contained an old stain. A stain? Finch stared. Surely you do not imagine a Victorian sewing basket has relevance to a modern murder? Miss Marple looked at him kindly. My dear Inspector, human beings rarely invent entirely new wickedness. They merely repeat old patterns with slight variations. Finch wrote something reluctantly. You believe the basket mattered to Evelyn Harbury? I believe, said Miss Marple carefully, that she was frightened of something. And frightened people often conceal clues inside ordinary objects because they assume nobody will look there. Inspector Finch leaned forward. Did she say anything to you? No. But? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. She looked several times toward the exhibition room before she died. Finch was silent. You really do observe everything, don't you? Miss Marple smiled.
Oh, dear no.
Only human nature. At 6 o'clock that evening the village received fresh excitement. Dr. Leonard Graves was arrested. The news spread through Willowbrook with the speed of lightning. Curtains twitched all along the high street. People emerged from cottages carrying entirely unnecessary shopping baskets merely to obtain information. By supper-time, public opinion had settled comfortably into certainty. The doctor had quarreled with Evelyn Harbury. He had opportunity. He had motive. And according to several delighted witnesses, he had looked positively guilty. Mrs. Carter arrived breathless at Rosebank Cottage shortly after 7. They've arrested him. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Yes, I heard. Well, surely that settles matters.
Does it?
Mrs. Carter stared. My dear Jane, what more could there possibly be? Miss Marple laid down her wool. Several things trouble me. For instance, the doctor is an intelligent man. Cyanide is dramatic and extremely recognizable. It is not the poison one chooses when hoping to avoid suspicion. Mrs. Carter frowned. Well, perhaps he panicked. Perhaps. And they argued publicly, which again seems rather obvious. Mrs. Carter looked exasperated. You always distrust obvious things? My dear Elspeth, obvious things are very often arranged intentionally. A log shifted softly in the fireplace. Outside, rain continued steadily over Willowbrook. Miss Marple reached for her knitting again, but her expression had grown distant, because somewhere beneath the village gossip, beneath the hurried arrest and frightened whispers, she felt the presence of something older, something hidden carefully for many years, and somehow, though she could not yet explain precisely how it was connected to the sewing basket. The shadow inside it had not begun yesterday. It had begun long ago. Briar Cottage stood at the far edge of Willowbrook, where the lane narrowed into hedgerows, and the village gradually surrendered itself to fields. It was an attractive house in a melancholy way. The garden had once been carefully loved. Even now, despite neglect, late roses climbed the brick walls and lavender struggled bravely beside the path. But there remained about the cottage the unmistakable atmosphere of interrupted plans. Miss Marple noticed such atmospheres immediately. Inspector Finch, accompanying her reluctantly through the gate the following morning, noticed only damp gravel and mud upon his shoes. I still fail to understand, he said, why you wished particularly to see the house yourself. Miss Marple adjusted her scarf. My dear Inspector, houses are very like people. They reveal character through small, untidy details. Finch gave the non-committal grunt of a man who considered such remarks highly unhelpful. The front door was opened by a nervous maid named Alice Brent, whose eyes had plainly swollen from recent crying. "Oh, good morning, sir. We need another look through the premises," Finch informed her. "Yes, sir, though it still feels dreadful being here." "That is natural," Miss Marple said kindly. The girl looked gratefully at her. "There's hardly been a moment's peace since it happened. Journalists telephoned twice yesterday. And Mrs. Bellamy came with a pie, though mostly she seemed interested in questions." Miss Marple thought this sounded extremely like Mrs. Bellamy. The maid lowered her voice. "I still can't believe Miss Evelyn is dead." "No?" said Miss Marple gently. Alice shook her head. She wasn't the sort somehow. Miss Marple glanced quietly toward the staircase. What sort was she? The girl hesitated. Strong, I suppose. Not frightened of things. Inspector Finch exchanged a brief look with Miss Marple. Fear again. The cottage drawing-room remained precisely as Evelyn Harbury had left it. Books lay scattered untidily across tables. A cigarette-holder rested beside an ashtray overflowing with lipstick-marked cigarette ends. Fresh flowers drooped forgotten in a vase near the window. Miss Marple moved slowly about the room while Finch examined papers. Above the mantel hung a photograph of Evelyn beside a much older woman. "Her aunt?" asked Miss Marple. Alice nodded. "Miss Arabella Harbury. She left the cottage to Miss Evelyn after she passed." "When was that?" "Last autumn, miss." Miss Marple studied the photograph thoughtfully. The older woman possessed the same dark eyes as Evelyn, though harder somehow. Suspicious eyes. Eyes that expected disappointment and generally received it. Finch, meanwhile, had discovered unpaid bills. "What is it, Inspector?" "Debt," he replied shortly. "Considerable—" "What is it, Inspector?" "Debt," he replied shortly. "Considerable debt." Miss Marple did not seem surprised. "Was Miss Harbury extravagant?" she asked the maid. "Oh, yes, miss. Beautiful dresses and things from London, though she often said appearances mattered terribly." "Did they?" Alice looked uncertain. "I think perhaps they mattered to her." Miss Marple wandered toward the writing desk near the window. Several drawers had already been searched by police. One stood half open, revealing gloves, old letters, and theater programs. Then Miss Marple's attention fixed suddenly upon something very small indeed. A packet of sewing needles, entirely ordinary, yet beside it lay a reel of dark green silk thread identical to thread she had seen in the old sewing basket at Hawthorne Lodge. Her eyes sharpened faintly. "Inspector," she said quietly, "did you notice this?" Finch glanced over. "The thread? It proves nothing." "No," said Miss Marple, "but it suggests continuation." The inspector stared. "Continuation of what?" "Habits, perhaps. Family habits especially tend to continue." Finch rubbed his forehead. Miss Marple's observations frequently produced in him the sensation of standing beside a puzzle while someone calmly described pieces from an entirely different box. They found the burned letter fragments preserved carefully in an envelope upon the dining table. Finch spread them out. Most were useless blackened scraps, but Miss Marple examined them with extraordinary concentration. At length she pointed delicately with one finger. Finch bent nearer. A partial sentence remained visible. "She never knew the truth about your mother." The inspector frowned. "You think the letter-writer knew the victim personally?"
"Oh, certainly."
Miss Marple leaned back slightly. "Anonymous letters nearly always come from emotional familiarity. Strangers prefer direct cruelty. Anonymous cruelty is intimate." Inspector Finch looked at her oddly. "Have you encountered many anonymous letters?" "My dear Inspector," said Miss Marple, "villages run upon them." Upstairs, Evelyn's bedroom overlooked the back garden. The room itself surprised Miss Marple. She had expected elegance and vanity. Instead, she found signs of tension. Several dresses lay discarded carelessly over chairs. Cosmetic jars stood uncapped. A traveling case remained half-packed upon the bed. Inspector Finch noticed it simultaneously. "She intended going somewhere." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. The inspector opened the case. Inside lay folded clothing, railway timetables, and an envelope containing £50 in cash. "Interesting," he murmured. Miss Marple was looking elsewhere. On the dressing-table stood a framed photograph turned face down. She lifted it gently. A young man smiled out in military uniform. Handsome, fair-haired. Confident. Across the bottom had been written, "To Evelyn always yours, Stephen." "Who is he?" Finch asked sharply. The maid flushed. "Captain Stephen Armitage, sir. He visited several times."
"When?"
"Mostly during winter." "Frequently?" Alice hesitated. "Yes, sir." "Were they engaged?"
"I don't know."
But Miss Marple noticed the girl's discomfort, and discomfort generally indicated knowledge. After a pause, she asked softly, "Did Dr. Graves know Captain Armitage?" "Oh, yes, miss. Everyone did." "Were they friends?" Alice considered carefully. "I don't think so exactly." Miss Marple nodded. That answer, too, was revealing. By noon the rain had stopped. Miss Marple walked home slowly through Willowbrook while Inspector Finch returned to the station. The village seemed quieter than usual, subdued beneath the weight of scandal. Yet beneath the quiet she sensed excitement simmering steadily. People enjoyed murder far more than they admitted. Outside the butcher's shop, Major Fanshawe intercepted her. "Morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Major." Extraordinary business." The Major lowered his voice. "I always distrusted the doctor myself. Did you? Too polished. Men who polish themselves excessively usually conceal things." Miss Marple thought privately that the Major himself polished his boots with military obsession but chose not to mention it. Instead, she said mildly, "Do you believe Dr. Graves capable of murder?" The Major hesitated.
"Well,
"But somehow not efficient enough." Miss Marple glanced at him quickly.
yes."
"Murder requires nerve. Graves always struck me as the anxious sort." Miss Marple continued thoughtfully along the lane afterward. Frightened. Those descriptions returned repeatedly, not merely concerning Dr. Graves, concerning Evelyn too, and Lavinia Penrith. Fear moved invisibly through the case like a draught beneath a closed door. That evening Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Lavinia Penrith arrived shortly before dusk, pale and visibly agitated. "My dear Miss Marple, forgive me for calling unannounced." "Not at all. Do come in." Lavinia sat near the fire but did not remove her gloves. Again Miss Marple noticed it. People who remained gloved indoors often wished emotionally to remain protected. After several strained moments Lavinia burst out, "They've made a terrible mistake arresting Dr. Graves." Miss Marple said quietly, "You believe him innocent?" "Why?" Lavinia twisted her hands together. "Because Leonard isn't brave enough." Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully upon her. "That is a curious reason, but true. He hates unpleasantness. Even dismissing servants upsets him. Yet frightened people may sometimes act desperately." Lavinia shook her head violently. "No, you don't understand." Miss Marple waited. Then very softly, "What is it I do not understand?" For a moment Lavinia seemed on the edge of confession. Her face tightened. "He was protecting someone," she whispered. Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap. "Whom?" Lavinia rose abruptly. "I shouldn't have come, my dear. I've already said too much." She moved toward the door, then paused suddenly. There was something odd about Evelyn after she inherited Briar Cottage. She became obsessed with old family papers, genealogies, things that happened years ago. Miss Marple spoke carefully. "And the sewing basket?" Lavinia turned completely pale. For several seconds she stared. "How did you know about that?" Miss Marple did not answer. Lavinia's voice dropped almost to a whisper. She believed something was hidden inside it. Something? The room seemed very quiet. Outside evening shadows gathered over Willowbrook. Miss Marple said gently, "What sort of secret?" But Lavinia Penrith had already lost courage. "I cannot explain." Then she hurried from the cottage before another word could stop her. Miss Marple remained motionless beside the fire. At last she reached slowly for her knitting again. Yet her thoughts no longer rested upon Evelyn Harbury's death alone, because now another possibility had begun forming quietly in her mind. Perhaps the murder had not been committed to conceal a recent scandal. Perhaps someone had killed to protect something buried for many years, something stitched carefully into the past, and somewhere at the center of it all sat an old sewing basket, waiting patiently for somebody to understand what had been hidden inside it. The following morning dawned unexpectedly bright. After several days of rain, Willowbrook emerged into sunlight with the grateful air of a village forgiven for something. Windows were thrown open. Gardeners reappeared. Chickens resumed wandering with moral certainty across lanes where they did not belong. But beneath the ordinary rhythms of village life lingered unease. People lowered their voices when speaking of Evelyn Harbury, and they spoke of little else. Miss Marple, carrying a modest basket and wearing her oldest gardening hat, made her way toward the church lane shortly after 10 o'clock. To any observer she appeared to be engaged in nothing more suspicious than a visit to Miss I's Bellamy for marmalade. In reality, Miss Marple had reached the stage of investigation she privately considered most important. Listening, not official questioning. Official questioning frightened people into caution. But ordinary conversation, gossip, recollection, complaint loosened memory wonderfully. Mrs. Bellamy received her enthusiastically. "My dear Miss Marple, you have come at exactly the right moment. I've just made fresh coffee." Miss Marple accepted this invitation with quiet satisfaction. The vicarage drawing-room smelled pleasantly of polish and toast. A fat tabby cat slept across the window-sill with the serenity of a creature untouched by murder. Mrs. Bellamy poured coffee eagerly. "Well," she announced at once, "the entire village believes the police have rushed things." "Oh," said Miss Marple mildly, "people are beginning to feel sorry for Dr. Graves. How quickly opinion changes." Mrs. Bellamy nodded vigorously. Yesterday everyone was convinced he poisoned Evelyn Harbury. Today people say he looked too miserable to be guilty." Miss Marple stirred her coffee. "Human beings do prefer emotional consistency in murderers," she observed. "They dislike discovering that unpleasant people may be innocent and charming people dangerous." Mrs. Bellamy leaned forward. "Between ourselves, Jane, I never entirely trusted Evelyn." "No?" "She asked questions." Miss Marple glanced up. "What sort of questions?" "Old village things. Families. Who married whom. What happened years ago." Mrs. Bellamy lowered her voice instinctively. "And she became terribly interested in the Penrith family." Miss Marple's expression remained calm. "In what way?" "She spent hours with old parish records. The vicar mentioned it several times." Miss Marple set down her cup. "Did she discover anything?" Mrs. Bellamy looked disappointed. "I haven't the faintest idea, though she and Lavinia Penrith quarrelled badly one afternoon outside the church hall." "That is interesting." "Yes, and not long afterward Evelyn began carrying that ridiculous little notebook everywhere." "A notebook?" Mrs. Bellamy nodded. "Black leather. She was forever writing things down." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened faintly. "Did the police find it?" "I don't know." Sharpened faintly. "Did the police find it?" "I don't know." But Miss Marple suspected they had not. The parish records room occupied a narrow stone chamber behind the vestry. Dust floated lazily through shafts of sunlight as the vicar, Reverend Stephen Hale, unlocked the door for Miss Marple later that afternoon. "A gloomy little place," he remarked apologetically, "though Miss Harbury seemed to enjoy it enormously." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "some people enjoy the past very much." The Reverend smiled. "And others fear it." Miss Marple glanced at him quickly. "You noticed that?" The vicar hesitated. "Well, there was tension. Miss Harbury occasionally upset people with her questions." "What sort of questions?" "Family matters chiefly." He moved uncertainly among the shelves. "She became particularly interested in an incident from nearly 30 years ago." Miss Marple waited quietly. "A young servant girl disappeared from Hawthorne Lodge." "Disappeared?" "Rather sad business. Her name was Clara Morton." Miss Marple folded her hands. "What happened to her?" No one knew precisely. The official assumption was that she went away to London, but unofficially? The vicar looked uncomfortable. Villages always produce rumors. There were suggestions of impropriety. "With whom?" Reverend Hale coughed. "The then master of Hawthorne Lodge, Colonel Penrith's father." Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully upon a row of crumbling registers. "And the sewing basket?" she asked quietly. The vicar blinked. "I beg your pardon? Did Clara Morton possess such a thing?" To her satisfaction the Reverend looked startled. "Yes, as a matter of fact she did. An embroidered sewing basket. It belonged to her mother before her." Miss Marple was silent. The Reverend stared at her. "How extraordinary!" "Not at all," said Miss Marple softly. "Human beings hide emotional things inside domestic objects constantly." An hour later she sat alone among the parish records while the Reverend attended a funeral visitation. Miss Marple turned pages patiently. Marriages, patterns. She had always believed villages resembled woven tapestries. Pull one thread and half the design shifted unexpectedly. At length she discovered Clara Morton's name. Then another entry caught her attention immediately. A baptism record. Stephen Arthur Morton, born October 1928. No father listed. Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly upon the page. Then, several years later, death of Clara Morton, coastal accident, Brighton, 1932. Her eyes narrowed thoughtfully. A child without acknowledged parentage. A servant girl connected to Hawthorne Lodge. And now Evelyn Harbury searching obsessively through family history. Outside, church bells rang softly across Willowbrook. Miss Marple closed the register slowly. Inspector Finch arrived at Rosebank Cottage shortly before supper, looking irritated. "This case," he announced, removing his hat, "becomes more complicated every hour." Miss Marple poured tea. "That is generally the nature of human beings." Finch ignored this. "Dr. Graves insists someone is framing him. Perhaps someone is. We searched Briar Cottage again." "And?" "No notebook." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "I thought not." The inspector stared. "You knew about it?" "Mrs. Bellamy mentioned it." Finch muttered something under his breath concerning village women. Then he produced a folded document. "We've identified Captain Stephen Armitage." Miss Marple accepted the paper. "He served in the army until recently. Excellent record. No criminal history. Does he live nearby?" "In London presently. We've requested his return for questioning." Miss Marple read silently. Then she looked up. "Inspector, did you notice his middle name?" Finch frowned. "Middle name? Morton." The inspector blinked. "Good Lord!" For a moment neither spoke. Then Finch said slowly, "You think he's connected to the servant girl?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that coincidences involving names are very rare in villages." Finch paced toward the fireplace. "But why would Evelyn investigate this now?" Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "Perhaps she discovered something about her own family." The inspector stopped abruptly. "You believe Evelyn Harbury herself was connected to Clara Morton?" "Possibly." "And if so?" Miss Marple looked toward the darkening window. "Then someone may have feared what she intended to reveal. That night a storm rolled across Willowbrook. Rain battered windows. Wind shook hedges violently in the lanes. Miss Marple sat awake later than usual, knitting untouched in her lap. Certain pieces had begun fitting together. Not neatly, but enough to reveal outlines. The old sewing basket. Clara Morton. Hidden parentage. Yet something still troubled her deeply. Because murder motivated purely by old scandal rarely produced such panic. Someone in Willowbrook remained frightened now. Not merely of disgrace, of exposure. And frightened people, Miss Marple knew, often made mistakes. As though summoned by the thought, the telephone rang suddenly downstairs. Miss Marple descended carefully. The line crackled badly in the storm. "Miss Marple?" The voice trembled. "Lavinia Penrith." "Yes." "What is it, my dear?" For several seconds only rain sounded through the receiver. Then Lavinia whispered, "He knows." Miss Marple's expression sharpened instantly. "Who knows what?" "He found the letters." "What letters?" But Lavinia was already crying. "You must come tomorrow." Before Arthur discovers everything. The line went dead. Miss Marple remained motionless beside the telephone. Outside thunder rolled over Willowbrook, and somewhere within Hawthorne Lodge, hidden among the quiet rooms and polished furniture, old secrets were beginning to wake. Hawthorne Lodge possessed a different atmosphere in the morning. By daylight its gracious proportions and climbing roses regained some authority over the unease hanging about the house. Yet even sunshine could not entirely dispel the sense that something strained and restless moved beneath its polished surfaces. Miss Marple arrived shortly after 10 o'clock. A maid admitted her nervously and led her into the morning-room, where Lavinia Penrith stood beside the window, twisting a lace handkerchief between trembling fingers. She looked as though she had scarcely slept. "My dear Miss Marple," she said quickly, "thank you for coming." Miss Marple sat calmly. "You sounded distressed." Lavinia glanced toward the closed door before speaking. "Arthur mustn't know I telephoned you." "Why not?" "Because he believes the entire matter finished now that Dr. Graves has been arrested." "And you do not?" Lavinia pressed her lips together. "No." Miss Marple waited patiently. It was one of her great gifts, the ability to remain silent without making silence uncomfortable. Under its influence, nervous people often continued speaking merely to fill the space. At last Lavinia said quietly, "There are letters. The letters you mentioned last night?" "Where did you find them?" Lavinia hesitated. "In the sewing basket." Miss Marple's eyes rested gently upon her. "I thought perhaps so." The younger woman looked startled. "You already guessed?" "My dear, people rarely become frightened over objects unless those objects contain memory." Lavinia sat abruptly. "She found them by accident." "Evelyn?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Tell me everything." For several moments Lavinia seemed uncertain whether to proceed. Then, with the desperate relief of someone long burdened by secrecy, the words came rapidly. "The sewing basket belonged to Clara Morton." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "The former housemaid." "Yes." Lavinia looked pale even in daylight. "She disappeared from Hawthorne Lodge years ago after an unfortunate situation." "With Colonel Penrith's father?" Lavinia lowered her eyes. The room grew very quiet. Outside, gardeners worked somewhere upon the lawn. Their distant voices drifted faintly through the open windows with deceptive normality. "What happened to Clara?" asked Miss Marple softly. "She left? Voluntarily?" Lavinia's silence answered sufficiently. Miss Marple said gently, "And the letters?" "They were hidden beneath the basket lining." Miss Marple's knitting needles would have clicked at such a moment ordinarily, but today her hands remained still. "What sort of letters?" Lavinia swallowed. "Love letters, from Colonel Edmund Penrith to Clara, the Colonel's father." "And Evelyn discovered them?" "She found the basket during preparations for the fete. One of the seams had come loose." Lavinia pressed trembling fingers to her forehead. She read everything. Did Colonel Penrith know?"
"No."
"But you did." Lavinia looked at her helplessly. "I found Evelyn with the letters 2 days before the fete." Miss Marple spoke very carefully. "And what did she say?" "That Clara Morton had a child, and that the child was Edmund Penrith's son." Miss Marple was silent. The implications settled quietly between them. A hidden heir, an illegitimate branch of the family, a secret preserved for nearly 30 years. At last Miss Marple asked, "Was Captain Stephen Armitage that child?" Lavinia stared. Then slowly she nodded. The full weight of the revelation seemed almost to exhaust her. Miss Marple, however, remained composed, not because the matter lacked seriousness, but because human nature rarely surprised her entirely. She had seen too many respectable families built delicately upon concealed shame. "What did Evelyn intend to do with this information?" she asked. "I don't know exactly. At first she seemed amused." Lavinia shivered faintly. "Later she became— to expose it? Perhaps, or blackmail the family." Lavinia looked genuinely shocked.
"No!"
"Evelyn wasn't wicked," Miss Marple said gently. "No one is entirely wicked, but frightened or desperate people may behave very badly." Lavinia rose and crossed to a cabinet near the fireplace. From within she withdrew a bundle tied with faded green ribbon. The letters. Miss Marple accepted them carefully. The paper had yellowed with age. The handwriting slanted passionately across the pages in dark ink. Several letters contained ordinary declarations of affection. Others revealed something more troubling. One sentence particularly caught Miss Marple's eye. "If the child is truly mine, Clara, you must never let my father discover it." Another. "You do not understand what inheritance means in this family." Miss Marple looked up slowly. "Inheritance," she repeated. Lavinia gave a miserable nod. The Penrith estate was entailed for generations. Scandal would have destroyed everything. Miss Marple continued reading. Then one final letter altered her expression entirely. "The basket will keep them safe. Nobody notices sewing things." She folded the page thoughtfully. "No," she murmured. "People very seldom do." Inspector Finch arrived unexpectedly before noon. Lavinia nearly dropped the teacup she was holding when the butler announced him. Finch entered briskly. Miss Marple." "I might have guessed." He stopped abruptly upon noticing the letters. "What's this?" Miss Marple handed him the bundle without comment. The inspector read rapidly. His eyebrows climbed steadily higher.
"Good heavens!"
"Yes," said Miss Marple. Finch looked toward Lavinia. "You concealed this evidence?" She flushed deeply. "I was trying to protect my family. You may have obstructed a murder investigation." Lavinia looked near collapse. Miss Marple intervened quietly. "My dear Inspector, families frequently conceal disgrace long after the original necessity disappears, particularly old families." Finch muttered something about people being fools. Then his expression sharpened. "Wait a moment. If Stephen Armitage was actually the Colonel's half-brother, then legally perhaps nothing," said Miss Marple. "But emotionally quite another matter." Finch paced once across the room. "And Evelyn knew all this. She could have ruined the Penrith family." "Quite possibly." The inspector stopped. "So Colonel Penrith had motive after all." Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead she asked, "Did Colonel Penrith know of the letters before Evelyn died?" Lavinia shook her head quickly. "I swear it." Finch frowned. "Then who else knew?" Lavinia hesitated, and in that hesitation Miss Marple noticed something important. Fear again. But not fear of Arthur. Marple noticed something important. Fear again. But not fear of Arthur Penrith. Fear of another name entirely. "Dr. Graves?" Miss Marple asked softly. Lavinia closed her eyes. The inspector stared. "Graves knew? He discovered Evelyn searching the basket several days before the fete," Lavinia whispered. "She showed him the letters. He became terribly upset," Miss Marple observed quietly, "because he understood the consequences." Finch's expression darkened. "That strengthens the case against him considerably." But Miss Marple remained thoughtful. "No," she said slowly, "not necessarily." Both turned toward her. "Why not?" demanded Finch. "Because Dr. Graves appears frightened rather than calculating, and frightened men generally avoid complicated crimes." Finch exhaled impatiently. "My dear lady, every suspect in this village seems frightened." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "which suggests they fear something larger than murder alone." After luncheon, Miss Marple requested permission to see the sewing basket again. Lavinia led her to the drawing-room, where the historical exhibition still remained partly arranged, abandoned after the tragedy. The basket sat precisely where it had before. Domestic, almost absurdly harmless. Miss Marple lifted it gently onto her lap. The faded silk lining indeed showed signs of recent disturbance. Carefully she examined the stitching. Then suddenly she paused. "Inspector." Finch came nearer. "What now?" Miss Marple pointed delicately. A tiny tear inside the lining revealed something wedged deep within the wicker frame. Using a hat-pin, she drew out a narrow folded strip of paper. Lavinia gasped. The paper proved brittle with age. Miss Marple unfolded it slowly. It was not a letter. It was a birth certificate. Silence filled the room. The document read, "Stephen Arthur Morton, father Edmund Penrith." Inspector Finch swore softly beneath his breath. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at the faded paper. "So," she said quietly, "someone hid the truth very carefully indeed." Lavinia sank into a chair, looking faint. But if the certificate remained hidden all these years, her voice faltered. Miss Marple completed the thought gently. Then Evelyn may not have been the first person to discover it. Inspector Finch's eyes narrowed instantly. "You think someone already knew, and killed to keep it secret?" Miss Marple's gaze remained upon the sewing basket. "Perhaps." Then, after a pause, "Or because the secret threatened something far more recent." That evening, as shadows lengthened over Willowbrook, another development disturbed the fragile calm. Captain Stephen Armitage arrived from London. The village observed his arrival with enormous interest from behind curtains and garden hedges. He was taller than Miss Marple expected, fair-haired, broad-shouldered, and carrying himself with the unconscious confidence of a military man accustomed to command. But beneath the confidence she detected strain immediately. Inspector Finch questioned him privately in the library at Hawthorne Lodge. Miss Marple did not attend. Yet later, as Stephen crossed the hall toward the front door, she happened to encounter him alone. For one moment they studied each other silently. Then he said abruptly, "They've told me you know about my mother." Miss Marple nodded. His jaw tightened. "She suffered because of this family. Very likely. And now Evelyn is dead because of it." Miss Marple's eyes remained steady. "Do you believe that?" He looked away toward the darkened windows. After a long silence he said, "I think someone in this house has been lying for 30 years. Then he departed into the evening mist. Miss Marple watched him go thoughtfully, because suddenly, quite unexpectedly, she no longer believed Evelyn Harbury had intended blackmail at all. Instead, she began suspecting something infinitely more dangerous. Evelyn had been searching for the truth, and truth, Miss Marple knew, could terrify people far more than scandal ever could. The atmosphere in Willowbrook altered perceptibly after Captain Stephen Armitage's arrival. Until then, the murder of Evelyn Harbury had remained comfortably distant for many villagers, exciting, tragic, and suitable for discussion over tea. But the appearance of a possible hidden heir to Hawthorne Lodge transformed the affair into something far more unsettling. Old families made people nervous. Old secrets made them positively superstitious. By the following morning the village had already decided 3 contradictory things simultaneously. That Stephen Armitage had returned to claim the Penrith estate. That Colonel Penrith intended to disinherit everyone immediately. And that Miss Marple undoubtedly knew the truth about everything. The last assumption, at least, possessed some accuracy. Miss Marple sat in her garden shortly after breakfast, considering the matter carefully while knitting a pale grey scarf. Not the murder alone, the timing. Timing, she believed, often revealed motive more clearly than evidence. Someone had lived peacefully with the Penrith secret for nearly 30 years. Why kill now? Because Evelyn had discovered something new. Not merely the existence of Stephen Armitage, something else, something dangerous enough to transform old shame into present panic. A shadow crossed the garden path. Miss Marple looked up. Dr. Leonard Graves stood at the gate. He appeared exhausted. The strain of arrest, questioning, and village suspicion had reduced him visibly within days. His clothes hung untidily. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. "My dear doctor," said Miss Marple gently. "Docome," he obeyed almost gratefully. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "Not at all." She indicated a chair beneath the apple tree. Tea was produced. Dr. Graves accepted it with trembling hands. For several moments neither spoke. At last he said quietly, "They still believe I killed her." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "But you do not."
"No."
The doctor stared. "Why?" Miss Marple laid aside her knitting. "Because you are afraid of something entirely different." For a moment genuine shock crossed his face. Then, slowly, some of the tension left him. "You really do see everything." "Oh, no," said Miss Marple. only inconsistencies. The doctor gave a tired laugh. I suppose I should feel relieved. You might begin, said Miss Marple calmly, by telling me the truth. He looked toward the hedges where bees moved lazily among late roses. I cared for Evelyn, but not in the way people think. Miss Marple remained silent. She came to me 3 months ago asking questions about Clara Morton. His voice grew strained. At first I assumed it was simple curiosity. Then she discovered the letters and the birth certificate. Miss Marple watched him closely. You were frightened. I had reason. What reason? The doctor's fingers tightened around his teacup. Because Clara Morton did not die accidentally. The garden seemed suddenly very still. Even the distant church bell sounded unnaturally sharp. Miss Marple said softly, You know this? How? Dr. Graves swallowed. My father attended her. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened immediately. Your father was the village doctor then? He knew Clara Morton personally. The doctor nodded miserably. He treated her after she left Hawthorne Lodge. She was living in Brighton under another name. He told me once years ago, after too much whiskey, that she was terrified before she died. Miss Marple spoke carefully. Terrified of whom? Dr. Graves looked directly at her. Colonel Headman Penrith. The implications settled heavily between them. Miss Marple folded her hands quietly in her lap. Go on. My father believed Penrith visited Clara shortly before her death, and afterward she drowned. Was it considered suspicious? Dr. Graves gave a bitter smile. In 1932? A disgraced servant girl with an illegitimate child? People preferred convenient explanations. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Human nature again. Respectability protected itself with remarkable efficiency. Did Evelyn know this? She asked. The doctor hesitated. And how did she react? She became obsessed. He rubbed tiredly at his forehead. She believed Clara had been murdered. Miss Marple's knitting remained untouched beside her chair. And did you believe it too? The doctor did not answer immediately. At last he whispered. A wind moved softly through the garden. Miss Marple studied him with grave attention. Then perhaps, she said quietly, we are dealing with 2 murders rather than 1. Dr. Graves looked suddenly ill. You see why I was frightened. If Evelyn intended exposing everything, she threatened someone. Exactly. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but not necessarily Colonel Penrith. The doctor looked startled. You think Arthur innocent? I think Arthur Penrith is pompous, financially anxious, and excessively proud of his ancestors. None of those qualities make him a murderer automatically. But his father is dead, said Miss Marple softly. Which means another person may have stronger reasons for silence now. The doctor stared at her. Then, suddenly, Lavinia. Miss Marple did not reply, but inwardly she had already considered the possibility. That afternoon Inspector Finch received unwelcome news. The black leather notebook belonging to Evelyn Harbury had been discovered. Not intact, burned. A village boy had found the charred remains in a ditch near Miller's Lane. Finch examined the fragments grimly inside the station office. Most pages proved unreadable, yet several partial sentences survived. Graves knows what happened. She was pushed, basket lining concealed, and finally in jagged half-burned writing, Lavinia saw. Inspector Finch stared at the words for a long time. Then he telephoned Hawthorne Lodge immediately. Miss Marple arrived there scarcely an hour later. The house had become tense again. Servants moved quietly. Doors closed softly. Fear had returned. Inspector Finch stood in the library beside the fireplace. The burned notebook fragments spread before him. Colonel Penrith looked furious. Lavinia looked close to collapse. This is absurd, the colonel declared. Ancient gossip and hysterical nonsense. Finch's expression remained firm. Miss Harbury appears to have believed Clara Morton was murdered. Preposterous. Did your father know Clara Morton intimately? A dangerous silence followed. Colonel Penrith's face darkened. My father was a gentleman. Miss Marple thought privately that gentlemen were often responsible for the most unfortunate situations. Finch continued. Did Miss Harbury confront you with these allegations? No. Lavinia spoke suddenly. She confronted me. Everyone turned toward her. Her hands trembled violently now. She came here the night before the fete. She said she intended learning the truth about Clara. Inspector Finch's voice sharpened. What truth? Lavinia pressed both hands against her temples. She believed Clara tried to leave with the child, and someone stopped her. Colonel Penrith stared at his sister in astonishment. Lavinia, this is madness." "No," she whispered. "No, Arthur." "It isn't." Miss Marple watched her very carefully. "Not merely fear now. Old guilt, the kind carried for years." Later that evening Miss Marple walked home alone through the village lanes. Twilight gathered softly over Willowbrook. Lights glowed warmly behind curtains. Somewhere a piano played faintly. Ordinary life persisted stubbornly despite murder and suspicion. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts remained troubled, because something still refused to align properly. If Evelyn believed Clara Morton had been murdered, why had she waited until now to investigate? And why had she become frightened only recently? Then suddenly she remembered something small, something almost absurdly trivial. The half-packed suitcase at Briar Cottage. Railway timetables. Evelyn had intended leaving. Quickly, not triumphant blackmail. Miss Marple stopped walking. A terrible possibility entered her mind. Suppose Evelyn had discovered not merely an old murder, but the identity of the person who committed it, and suppose that person was still alive. The evening air suddenly felt colder. Miss Marple resumed walking slowly. By the time she reached Rosebank Cottage she knew one thing with certainty. Someone in Willowbrook had killed once before, and if frightened enough they might kill again. 3 days after the discovery of Evelyn Harbury's burned notebook, Miss Marple announced unexpectedly that she intended visiting Brighton. Mrs. Elspeth Carter nearly dropped her teacup. "Brighton? At this time?" "Yes," said Miss Marple placidly. "Sea air can be extremely restorative." Mrs. Carter narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "You are investigating again." "My dear Elspeth, elderly ladies are always investigating. It is merely called taking an interest," which as usual did not answer the question at all. The train journey passed quietly beneath a sky of shifting grey cloud. Miss Marple sat beside the carriage window with folded hands and apparently vague attention. In reality her thoughts arranged themselves with increasing precision. Clara Morton had died there in 1932, officially by accident, unofficially by fear. And somewhere between those two truths lay the reason Evelyn Harbury had been murdered. Upon arriving, Miss Marple proceeded not to the seaside promenade, but to a narrow residential district several streets inland. There she stopped before a modest boarding-house with peeling green paint and lace curtains yellowed by age. A brass plaque identified it as, "Mr. Dalrymple Rooms Available." Miss Marple rang the bell. The woman who answered appeared at least 80, though still brisk beneath layers of black wool and disapproval. "Yes? Monsieur Dalrymple? I am Mrs. Dalrymple. My name is Miss Marple. I hoped perhaps you might remember a young woman named Clara Morton who stayed here many years ago." The old landlady's expression altered almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple noticed it immediately. "You had better come in," Mrs. Dalrymple said. The sitting-room smelled faintly of coal dust and lavender polish. Mrs. Dalrymple remained standing while Miss Marple sat politely near the fire. "That was a long time ago," the landlady said sharply. "Why ask now?" "Because her niece has recently been murdered." Silence followed. Then Mrs. Dalrymple lowered herself slowly into a chair. "I wondered whether trouble would return one day." Miss Marple waited quietly. Old people often spoke best when uninterrupted. At last Mrs. Dalrymple said, "Clara came here with a little boy." "She was frightened?" The old woman gave a grim nod. "Always looking behind her, jumping whenever the bell rang." "Did she say whom she feared? A gentleman?" The word carried profound bitterness. "She never used his name." Miss Marple folded her hands. "But you knew it?" Mrs. Dalrymple's mouth tightened. "One didn't need telling. Men like that carried themselves a certain way." "What happened before her death?" The landlady stared toward the dark window. "She received a visitor." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Amon?" "Colonel Edmund Penrith." Mrs. Dalrymple hesitated. Then slowly, "No." For the first time since entering the house, Miss Marple felt genuinely surprised. "No? It was a woman." The room seemed suddenly colder. Miss Marple said very softly, "A woman. Did Clara know her?" "Oh, yes." "Who was she?" "Mrs." Dalrymple looked uneasy now, as though memory itself disturbed her. "A fine lady from the country, well-dressed." She swallowed. Cold eyes. Miss Marple's heartbeat quickened slightly. "Did you learn her name?" But Clara became terrified after the visit. "What happened? She cried all night?" "Said they would take the boy away." Miss Marple remained motionless. "And afterward?" 2 days later Clara drowned. The old woman crossed herself faintly. They called it accident, but I never believed it. Why not? Mrs. Dalrymple looked directly at Miss Marple. Because Clara was terrified of water. Outside, gulls cried faintly beyond the rooftops. Miss Marple sat very still. A woman, not Colonel Edmund Penrith. And suddenly several pieces shifted position in her mind. Not a man protecting reputation. A woman protecting family. A woman with cold eyes. Lavinia Penrith. But no impossible. 30 years ago, Lavinia would have been scarcely more than a girl herself. Miss Marple's thoughts halted abruptly. Not Lavinia. Another woman. Someone older. Someone now dead, perhaps, yet connected somehow to the present fear consuming Lavinia. Miss Marple asked carefully, "Did Clara leave anything behind?" Mrs. Dalrymple frowned. "Only sewing things mostly. Threads and pattern." She paused. "Though there was one odd thing." "Yes?" "A photograph disappeared after her death." "What sort of photograph?" "The child with his father." Miss Marple's expression changed instantly. "Father?" Clara kept it hidden in her Bible. "Did you see it?" "Only once." Mrs. Dalrymple leaned closer. The father wasn't Colonel Penrith. For several seconds Miss Marple did not speak at all. Then quietly, "Are you certain?" "Quite certain." Younger man. Dark hair. Miss Marple felt the entire structure of the case tilt beneath her thoughts. Stephen Armitage might not have been Edmund Penrith's son at all, which meant someone had lied. Someone had hidden the photograph. Someone had allowed a false story to survive for 30 years. And Evelyn Harbury had discovered the truth. Miss Marple returned to Willowbrook the following afternoon deeply troubled. Inspector Finch met her at the station. "You've been busy," he remarked dryly. "Find anything useful?" Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at the platform. "Inspector, have you ever noticed how willingly people believe dramatic stories merely because they are dramatic?" Finch sighed. "I was afraid you'd say something like that. The Penrith scandal may be largely incorrect." That captured his attention instantly.
"What?"
Miss Marple recounted Mrs. Dalrymple's testimony carefully. The inspector listened in growing astonishment. "A photograph?" he said. "And not Penrith, so it seems." Finch removed his hat irritably. "Then who was the father?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is precisely the question." They began walking slowly toward the village. After several moments Finch said, "If Evelyn discovered Stephen Armitage wasn't actually a Penrith, the inheritance motive disappears entirely. And Dr. Graves knew Clara Morton." "Indeed." Finch stopped walking abruptly. "Good Lord!" Miss Marple looked at him quietly. "You see it too. The doctor's father treated Clara." "Yeah." "And Graves himself resembles Stephen Armitage slightly." Miss Marple nodded. "Not strongly, but enough. Dark hair. Similar eyes. Enough for resemblance to whisper quietly beneath years of assumption." Inspector Finch looked stunned. "You think Stephen Armitage may actually be related to the Graves family?" "I think," said Miss Marple softly, "that someone constructed a false scandal many years ago because the real truth was far more dangerous." That evening tension thickened once again at Hawthorne Lodge. Captain Stephen Armitage confronted Dr. Graves privately in the library. Their voices carried through the half-open door. "You knew my mother?" "Yes." "You lied to me all my life?" "It was not my secret alone." Miss Marple, arriving unexpectedly with Inspector Finch, heard enough to understand the violence beneath the exchange. Then Stephen emerged abruptly into the hall. His face had gone white with fury. "You," he said hoarsely to the doctor, "are my father, aren't you?" Dr. Graves closed his eyes. No one spoke. The silence itself became confession. At last the doctor whispered, "Yes." Stephen stared at him with something beyond anger. Years of false identity shifted visibly across his expression. "And my mother died because of this?" "No," the doctor said desperately. "I tried to protect her." "From whom?" The question hung heavily in the room. Miss Marple watched Lavinia Penrith standing at the staircase above, watching, terrified. And in that moment Miss Marple understood something else. Lavinia was not protecting the Penrith family. She was protecting Dr. Graves, which meant the danger did not lie in the past alone. It lay in something that happened much more recently. Something connected directly to Evelyn Harbury's death. For the first time since Evelyn Harbury's murder, Willowbrook became truly frightened, not excited, not scandalized, frightened. Because hidden parentage and old disgrace were one thing. Villagers could discuss such matters with horrified enjoyment while trimming roses or purchasing bacon. But another possibility had now emerged. Someone had lied for 30 years, and someone had killed to preserve the lie. The distinction altered everything. By the following morning curtains twitched less openly. Conversation ceased abruptly when footsteps approached. People locked doors that had remained unlocked for generations. Miss Marple noticed all of it. Fear, she always believed, revealed character far more accurately than comfort. Inspector Finch spent most of that morning questioning Dr. Leonard Graves again. The interview took place inside the library at Hawthorne Lodge, now permanently burdened with tension. Miss Marple sat quietly nearby knitting while Finch conducted the questioning with increasing impatience. "So let us understand this clearly," the inspector said. "You fathered Clara Morton's child." Dr. Graves nodded tiredly. "And yet allowed everyone to believe Colonel Penrith's father was responsible." The doctor's face tightened. "It was not deliberate at first. But later? I was young," he said bitterly. "Coward." Clara feared scandal. "My father insisted silence was best," Miss Marple observed gently. "Silence often appears merciful initially." Dr. Graves looked at her. "Yes." "Until it begins destroying lives," Finch continued sharply. "Did Colonel Edmund Penrith know the child wasn't his? Then why write the letters?" The doctor gave a weary laugh. "Because Clara asked him to." Inspector Finch blinked. "Why?" "She needed protection. Edmund Penrith agreed to pretend responsibility because the real truth would have ruined my career before it even began." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused softly. Human kindness, she reflected sadly, often created the worst complications. The doctor continued. "Edmund was reckless but not cruel. He helped Clara financially after she left Willowbrook. And the photograph Mrs. Dalrymple mentioned?" Dr. Graves lowered his eyes. "I took it." "Why?" "Because I was afraid." Silence followed. Then Finch said, "You mean you hid evidence?" "And Evelyn Harbury discovered this recently." The doctor nodded miserably. "She confronted me 2 weeks before the fete." "What did she want?" "At first," he swallowed. "Later she became frightened." Miss Marple looked up immediately. "Frightened of whom?" Dr. Graves hesitated. Then quietly, "She believed someone followed her." The room seemed suddenly colder. Inspector Finch leaned forward. "I don't know." "But she suspected someone?" "Yes." Miss Marple spoke very softly. "Did she mention Lavinia Penrith?" Dr. Graves looked Did she mention Lavinia Penrith? Dr. Graves looked genuinely startled. "No." Miss Marple resumed knitting. "Very interesting indeed. Because Lavinia remained terrified, yet apparently not of exposure concerning Stephen Armitage's parentage. Something else still lay hidden, something separate. That afternoon Miss Marple visited Briar Cottage alone. The police search had ended temporarily. The cottage now stood quiet and abandoned beneath drifting autumn sunlight. Inside, the silence felt oppressive. Miss Marple moved slowly through the drawing-room, observing details others overlooked. A shifted chair, ashes inside the grate, a faint perfume lingering still in the curtains. Evelyn Harbury remained present in the room through absence itself. Miss Marple climbed the staircase thoughtfully. She paused outside Evelyn's bedroom, then entered. The half-packed suitcase still rested near the wardrobe. Inspector Finch had examined it thoroughly already. Yet Miss Marple knelt beside it once more. Women packed emotionally, she always thought. Men packed practically. Therefore luggage frequently revealed state of mind. Evelyn had packed quickly. Nightgowns crumpled carelessly, jewelry missing, cash hidden inside stockings, and tucked into the lining. Miss Marple's fingers stopped. A railway cloakroom receipt, London Victoria Station, dated the day before the fete. Her eyes sharpened instantly. Evelyn had already sent luggage ahead, meaning she intended permanent departure, not blackmail. Miss Marple sat back slowly. Someone had frightened Evelyn badly enough to make her run. Then she noticed something else. A single page torn from a notebook and wedged deep within the suitcase corner. Only a fragment remained. "If anything happens to me, ask Lavinia about the lake." Miss Marple stared at the sentence for a long time. The lake. There was only one lake connected to Hawthorne Lodge, the ornamental lake beyond the old cedar grove. And suddenly, with dreadful clarity, she remembered Lavinia's expression whenever Clara Morton's death was discussed. Not fear of scandal. Memory. Twilight had begun falling when Miss Marple reached the cedar grove behind Hawthorne Lodge. The lake lay dark beneath overhanging trees, still as glass except where fallen leaves drifted slowly across its surface. Lavinia Penrith stood beside the water. She turned sharply at Miss Marple's approach.
Oh!
You came here intentionally, Miss Marple observed gently. Lavinia looked exhausted beyond concealment now. The lake troubles you. Then suddenly Lavinia whispered. She knew. Miss Marple waited. Evelyn knew what happened. What did happen, my dear? For several seconds Lavinia seemed unable to speak. Then the words emerged brokenly. Clara came back. Miss Marple's heartbeat quickened. Back to Willowbrook? One night, secretly.
When?
Before her death. Lavinia stared blindly across the water. I saw her arguing with my mother beside the lake. Miss Marple remained perfectly still. Your mother? Lady Penrith, dead these 12 years. Cold eyes. A woman in gloves and a veil. Everything aligned suddenly. Lavinia continued shakily. Clara wanted money. She threatened exposure. My mother was terrified of disgrace. And then they argued. Her voice dropped almost to nothing. Clara slipped. Miss Marple said quietly, Into the lake. Did your mother push her? Lavinia closed her eyes. I don't know. The answer itself revealed enough. A sound interrupted them suddenly. Branches cracking. Both women turned sharply. A figure moved among the trees near the path. Then a cry rang out. Male. Followed immediately by a heavy splash. Inspector Finch, arriving moments later after Miss Marple's urgent telephone message, found chaos beside the lake, and floating face downward in the dark water. Dr. Leonard Graves. The body was pulled ashore quickly, but even before examination Finch's expression hardened grimly. Lavinia began trembling violently. No, Miss Marple knelt quietly beside the doctor. There were bruises near the throat. Not accidental drowning. Murder again. Inspector Finch rose slowly. This changes everything. Yes, said Miss Marple softly, because now the killer had struck twice, and this second murder revealed something critical. Dr. Graves had not been protecting himself. He had been protecting someone else, someone still alive, someone desperate enough to silence him permanently. Miss Marple looked toward Lavinia Penrith. The younger woman stood frozen beside the lake, horror etched across her face. But Miss Marple no longer believed Lavinia was the killer. Lavinia feared the truth, but another person feared exposure even more. And for the first time Miss Marple thought she knew exactly who that person was. The death of Dr. Leonard Graves shattered the remaining illusion that Willowbrook's tragedy belonged safely to the past. Now there could be no comforting theories of old scandals resurfacing accidentally. Someone alive in the village was killing deliberately, and doing so with increasing desperation. Inspector Finch established police presence at Hawthorne Lodge immediately after the drowning. Constables moved through the grounds. Lamps burned late into the night. Servants whispered behind doors. Yet despite the activity, Miss Marple sensed something curiously fragile beneath the investigation. The truth lay very near now, near enough that people had begun speaking less carefully, which was dangerous, because murderers often became reckless precisely when silence mattered most. The following morning dawned pale and cold. Miss Marple sat beside her sitting-room fire while Inspector Finch paced irritably across the carpet. "You're very quiet," he remarked. "That generally means you've decided something unpleasant." Miss Marple threaded fresh wool calmly through her needles. "My dear Inspector, unpleasant things are usually decided long before I arrive. I merely noticed them." Finch stopped pacing. "You think Graves was murdered to stop him talking?" "Yes, and the killer was hiding near the lake yesterday." "Obviously." The inspector rubbed tiredly at his mustache. "We found footprints near the cedar path, small ones." Miss Marple glanced up briefly. "A woman's?" Neither spoke for a moment. Then Finch said slowly, "You suspect Lavinia Penrith?" "No." The answer came instantly. Inspector Finch stared. "After what she admitted?" "She admitted fear, guilt, and concealment," said Miss Marple quietly. "Those are not identical to murder. She was present when Clara Morton died." "Yeah." "As a frightened girl. And now Graves is dead," which distressed her genuinely. Finch resumed pacing. "You're certain?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Inspector, women who commit murder rarely tremble afterward. They become calmer." The inspector considered this unhappily. "Then who?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "The quiet person." Finch frowned. "What quiet person?" "The one everybody overlooks." That afternoon Willowbrook prepared for Dr. Graves's funeral. Death altered villages strangely. Even amidst suspicion and scandal, routines emerged automatically. Black clothing appeared. Casseroles arrived. People lowered voices respectfully while simultaneously exchanging theories with renewed enthusiasm. Miss Marple attended the church early, not for the service, for observation. She sat near the back while villagers entered slowly beneath the stained-glass windows. Colonel Penrith looked grey and exhausted. Stephen Armitage appeared rigid with contained emotion. Lavinia walked like a woman carrying invisible weight. And then Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Graves. The doctor's widow entered quietly and sat alone near the front. No tears, no dramatic grief, only stillness. Miss Marple watched her thoughtfully. Margaret Graves had always seemed colourless beside her husband, a thin, restrained woman with careful hair and an almost invisible manner. The sort of woman villagers forgot immediately after conversations ended. Invisible people, Miss Marple often reflected, observed far more than anyone imagined. During the service, Mrs. Graves never once lowered her head. She stared ahead with unnerving calm, and suddenly Miss Marple remembered something small but important. Years earlier, Mrs. Carter had described Margaret Graves as cold. Not emotional, not demonstrative. Yet coldness sometimes concealed tremendous force. After the funeral, Miss Marple deliberately positioned herself near the churchyard gate. Mrs. Graves emerged last. Miss Marple stepped gently into her path. "My dear Mrs. Graves," the widow paused politely. "Miss Marple, you have my deepest sympathy." "Thank you." Her voice sounded perfectly composed. Too composed, perhaps. Miss Marple said softly, "This has all been very painful for you." A pause. "You knew about Clara Morton?" For the first time something flickered behind Mrs. Graves's eyes. "Leonard told me years ago. And Stephen Armitage." Miss Marple looked at her carefully. "You kept the secret faithfully?"
"Of course."
"Even after Evelyn Harbury discovered it?" Mrs. Graves's expression remained unchanged. "Evelyn enjoyed disturbing people." Miss Marple noticed the choice of words immediately. Not blackmailing, not threatening. Emotional language, personal language. "She frightened you," Miss Marple said quietly. The widow's fingers tightened almost invisibly around her gloves. "She frightened everyone." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "Not everyone equally." For one suspended instant the two women looked directly at each other. Then Mrs. Graves said calmly, "You think very highly of your understanding of human nature, Miss Marple."
"Ah, no,"
said Miss Marple. "I merely compare people to others I have known. And what do I remind you of?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A headmistress in Tunbridge Wells who poisoned her invalid sister after 30 years of dutiful resentment. Very capable woman. Excellent flower arranger." Mrs. Graves stared. Then she walked away without another word. That evening Miss Marple visited Inspector Finch. The inspector looked up sharply as she entered. "Well?" Miss Marple removed her gloves carefully. "I believe Dr. Graves's widow murdered both her husband and Evelyn Harbury." Silence followed. Then Finch said, "That is an extremely serious accusation. What evidence have you?" "Psychology chiefly." The inspector groaned softly. "My dear lady, hear me out." Finch sat reluctantly. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Margaret Graves spent 30 years protecting her husband's disgrace. He fathered a child before marriage, and permitted another man to bear the scandal publicly. Imagine the humiliation, the secrecy, the bitterness." Finch frowned. "That still doesn't make her a murderer. But Evelyn Harbury changed matters."
"How?"
"She uncovered the truth. Not merely Stephen's parentage. She discovered Clara Morton probably died accidentally during confrontation with Lady Penrith, meaning Leonard Graves had concealed the real circumstances for decades." Inspector Finch leaned forward slowly. "And his wife blamed him." "Precisely." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Margaret Graves had endured humiliation quietly for years. Then suddenly Evelyn appeared, threatening exposure, scandal, gossip, perhaps even renewed investigation into Clara's death. And Graves himself became frightened, indecisive." Finch stared thoughtfully into the fire. "She killed Evelyn to preserve silence." "And Graves? He knew something after Evelyn died, perhaps not consciously, but enough to endanger her." The inspector stood abruptly. "But the lake yesterday. Margaret Graves followed Lavinia and the doctor there." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. When Leonard began speaking openly at last, she panicked. Finch paced slowly. "It fits. But we still need proof." Miss Marple nodded. "Fortunately," she said quietly, "I believe Mrs. Graves is nearing collapse. The opportunity arrived sooner than either expected." At 9 o'clock that evening, a maid from Hawthorne Lodge telephoned Rosebank Cottage in terror. Mrs. Graves had disappeared, and Stephen Armitage was missing as well. Inspector Finch arrived within minutes. Together he and Miss Marple hurried through darkened village lanes toward the lake. Mist drifted low across the water. The cedar grove stood black beneath the moonlight. Then they heard voices, one male, one female, sharp with emotion. Miss Marple quickened her pace surprisingly fast for her age. Near the lake shore they found Stephen Armitage facing Mrs. Graves. The widow held something glittering faintly in her hand. A revolver. Stephen's voice shook with fury. "You killed him." Mrs. Graves looked strangely calm. "He would have destroyed everything. You murdered Evelyn too. She ruined lives merely by existing." Miss Marple stepped quietly forward. "My dear Mrs. Graves," she said gently, "it is over." The widow turned. For the first time real emotion cracked across her face, not panic. "You cannot understand," she whispered. Miss Marple looked at her sadly. "Oh yes," she said. "I think perhaps I can." And very slowly Margaret Graves lowered the revolver. The mist over the lake thickened as though the night itself wished to conceal what remained to be said. Margaret Graves stood motionless beside the black water, the revolver hanging loosely at her side. Stephen Armitage did not move. Neither did Inspector Finch. Only Miss Marple advanced quietly across the damp grass until she stood a few feet from the widow. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Margaret Graves said in a tired voice, "She always noticed things." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Yeah." Even as a child Evelyn noticed things. A faint bitter smile touched the widow's mouth. "Some people are born dangerous that way." The revolver trembled once in her hand. Inspector Finch took a cautious step forward. "Mrs. Graves." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "Not yet." Something in her tone stopped him. Margaret looked at Miss Marple with exhausted eyes. "You already know everything." Looked at Miss Marple with exhausted eyes. "You already know everything." "Not everything," said Miss Marple gently, "but enough." The widow laughed once, a dry, hopeless sound. Enough is always too much in villages. At length Margaret Graves sat slowly upon the damp wooden bench beside the lake. The revolver rested beside her now, forgotten. Miss Marple remained standing nearby, her hands folded calmly before her. Stephen Armitage watched with rigid anger barely contained beneath self-control. Inspector Finch waited in silence, and under the cedar trees Margaret Graves began speaking. "I married Leonard because I loved him," she said quietly. "No one would doubt that," said Miss Marple.
Oh, they would.
The widow stared toward the lake. People always mistake quiet women for unemotional ones. Miss Marple thought privately that this was perfectly true. Margaret continued. "He told me about Clara before we married, about the child, about Edmund Penrith pretending responsibility." Stephen's jaw tightened painfully. Margaret glanced toward him. "Your mother wanted protection. Leonard wanted respectability. Edmund Penrith wanted drama." Her mouth twisted faintly. "Men arrange women's lives so carelessly." "And Lady Penrith?" Miss Marple asked softly. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. She discovered the truth eventually. Clara returned demanding money and threatening exposure. A pause. "There was an argument here beside the lake." Stephen's voice came harshly. "My mother was murdered." "No," Margaret whispered. She slipped. Silence fell heavily. She slipped, reaching for her child's photograph. Lady Penrith tried to stop her taking Stephen away. Margaret looked toward the black water. And then she fell. Miss Marple said quietly, "Lavinia witnessed it, and spent 30 years believing her mother guilty." Margaret nodded slowly. "But Lady Penrith did not kill Clara intentionally?" "No." Margaret's expression tightened with old pity. "She simply stood there afterward and did nothing." The wind stirred faintly through the cedars. "Because scandal mattered more than rescue," Miss Marple said. Margaret looked at her sharply. "You do understand?" "My dear," said Miss Marple softly, "I understand human weakness extremely well." Stephen Armitage spoke suddenly. "And Evelyn?" Margaret's face altered. Something cold entered it then. She found the photograph. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The missing photograph. The true father. The real history hidden beneath the false scandal. "She knew the entire story," Margaret continued. "Not just Stephen's parentage. Everything." "And she intended exposing it?" asked Finch. "No." The answer surprised them all except Miss Marple. Margaret gave a weary laugh. That was the absurd part. Evelyn wanted to leave Willowbrook entirely. She looked toward Stephen. "She pitied you." Stephen stared. "She planned giving you the photograph and the letters before disappearing." Miss Marple spoke quietly. "But she confronted you first." Margaret's fingers tightened together. The widow's voice became distant now, almost dreamlike. "She came to my house 2 nights before the fete. She said Leonard had lied to everyone for 30 years. She said truth mattered." A flicker of anger crossed her face. She laughed softly again. "People worship truth until it destroys them." Inspector Finch's expression hardened. "So you poisoned her?" Margaret did not answer immediately. At last she whispered, "I only meant to frighten her." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. Margaret looked up. "I put the cyanide into the teacup intending merely to threaten her later to make her believe someone wanted silence badly enough to kill." Her voice cracked faintly. "But at the fete she picked up the wrong cup." A terrible stillness followed. Even Finch looked shaken. "You're saying," he said slowly, "that Evelyn's death was accidental?" Margaret nodded once. Stephen Armitage turned away sharply, face white with rage and horror. Miss Marple remained very still, because now the final shape of the tragedy had emerged fully. Not a carefully planned murder at first. Weakness, panic, human beings stumbling blindly from one concealment into another until death became inevitable. "But Leonard discovered the truth afterward," Miss Marple said softly. Margaret closed her eyes. "He realized the poison cup had been prepared by someone familiar with the house, and he suspected you." The widow nodded. "He wanted confession, public disgrace." Her expression hardened suddenly with buried resentment. After 30 years of cowardice, he suddenly wished to become noble. Inspector Finch said grimly, "So you killed him beside the lake. I followed him and Lavinia there." Margaret's voice sounded exhausted beyond tears. "When he said he intended telling everything, I couldn't bear it any more." Stephen stared at her. "You drowned him." "No." For the first time genuine anguish crossed her face. "I only tried stopping him leaving. He slipped exactly as Clara slipped." Her voice broke. "The lake seems to enjoy repetition." Miss Marple looked at her sadly. "Yes," she said, "human nature does too." Far away across the village, church bells marked the hour faintly through mist. Margaret Graves suddenly seemed very old. "What happens now?" she asked. Inspector Finch stepped forward quietly. "I'm afraid you must come with me." She nodded without resistance. Then, unexpectedly, she turned to Stephen Armitage. "I am sorry about your mother." Stephen did not answer. Not from cruelty, perhaps, but because some griefs arrived too late for forgiveness. Later, after Mrs. Graves had been taken away and the lake lay silent once more beneath drifting fog, Miss Marple and Inspector Finch walked slowly back toward the village. For some distance neither spoke. Then Finch said heavily, "What a miserable business! It all began with one foolish lie." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, Inspector. It began with fear." He glanced at her. "Fear of scandal? Fear of unhappiness, fear of losing love, fear of disgrace." She sighed softly. "People commit dreadful acts trying merely to avoid pain." The village lights glimmered ahead through darkness. Finch shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "And the sewing basket?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A perfect hiding place. For the letters? For the truth." The inspector looked puzzled. Miss Marple continued softly. "Women spent generations hiding important things inside domestic life because nobody thought to look there. Men noticed safes and documents. They overlooked sewing baskets entirely." Finch gave a reluctant smile. "You noticed?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, "because village women are very alike everywhere." When Miss Marple finally reached Rosebank Cottage, dawn had begun faintly silvering the eastern sky. She lit a small fire and sat quietly beside it with her knitting untouched in her lap. The case was finished. Evelyn Harbury dead. Dr. Graves dead. Margaret Graves destroyed by 30 years of silence and resentment. And Stephen Armitage left carrying a history nobody had intended him to inherit. Outside, Willowbrook slept uneasily beneath morning mist. In time the village would recover. Roses would bloom again. People would gossip about newer scandals. Children would play beside hedges and church bells would ring over ordinary afternoons. But some shadows lingered, particularly those hidden carefully for years inside small harmless things, like secrets, like memory, like the shadow inside the sewing basket. In the weeks following the tragedy at Hawthorne Lodge, Willowbrook behaved exactly as villages always did after catastrophe. It recovered visibly long before it recovered privately. Shops reopened their ordinary conversations. The church flowers returned to cheerful arrangements. The brass band resumed practice on Thursdays with renewed enthusiasm and identical lack of rhythm. Outwardly, life repaired itself. Inwardly, however, the village carried bruises. People spoke more softly when passing Briar Cottage. The cedar grove near the lake became curiously avoided after dusk, and although no one admitted it openly, many villagers began regarding Hawthorne Lodge with a faint unease, as though old secrets might still linger beneath its polished floors. Miss Marple, sitting peacefully in her garden one mild October morning, observed these changes without surprise. Human beings, she reflected, preferred believing evil arrived dramatically from outside. They disliked discovering that it usually grew quietly inside ordinary lives. Mrs. Elspeth Carter arrived promptly at 11 carrying seed cake and a considerable quantity of curiosity. "My dear Jane," she announced before sitting down, "I still cannot comprehend Mrs. Graves." Miss Marple poured tea. "No? She always seems so dull." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Dull people are often underestimated, which can be dangerous." Mrs. Carter accepted cake thoughtfully. "Well, it all feels extraordinary. Poison, hidden children, old scandals." She lowered her voice instinctively, though nobody stood within hearing distance. "And to think it all began with that sewing basket." Miss Marple looked toward the roses. "No," she said gently. "It began much earlier than that." Mrs. Carter frowned. "I suppose you mean Clara Morton. And before her, perhaps. My goodness." Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. "Unhappiness passes through families rather like illness, unless someone interrupts it." Mrs. Carter looked puzzled. "Interrupts it how?" "With honesty, perhaps, or kindness." After a pause, she added softly, "Though people generally choose concealment instead." Across the village, Hawthorne Lodge had grown markedly quieter. Colonel Arthur Penrith now spent long hours alone in the library, confronting unpleasant realities concerning both his family history and finances. The revelations surrounding his parents had shaken him profoundly. Not merely scandal, disillusionment. Respectable men endured financial ruin more easily than shattered ancestry. Lavinia, meanwhile, had changed in subtler ways. Miss Marple noticed it during her first visit after the investigation concluded. The younger woman appeared tired still, but lighter somehow. The nervous strain that had haunted her for weeks had eased. Secrets exhausted people terribly. "You have been very kind," Lavinia said quietly as they sat together, overlooking the autumn gardens. "My dear, kindness costs remarkably little." Lavinia hesitated. "I spent years believing my mother committed murder. And all that time she had simply been afraid." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at the trees beyond the lawn. "Fear causes nearly as much suffering as wickedness." Lavinia's voice trembled faintly. "I should have told the truth long ago, perhaps, but I couldn't bear disgracing her memory." Miss Marple smiled gently. "The dead generally survive truth far better than the living imagine." Lavinia gave a weak laugh. Then, after a silence, "Stephen intends leaving England." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That may be wise. He says Willowbrook feels haunted now." Miss Marple did not disagree. Captain Stephen Armitage visited Rosebank Cottage 2 days later before his departure. He seemed older somehow than when he first arrived from London, not physically perhaps, but emotionally altered. Some discoveries rearranged a person permanently. Miss Marple received him beside the fire. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "There is no need." "There is every need." He stood awkwardly for a moment. "I spent most of my life believing myself unwanted by one man and protected by another. In reality it was the reverse." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "Yeah." Stephen stared into the fire. "My mother loved my father, didn't she?" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "I think she did." "And he loved her?" Miss Marple considered carefully. "In weak ways, perhaps, but genuinely." Stephen gave a bitter half-smile. "That sounds very English." Miss Marple thought this might indeed be true. After a pause he said, "I found something you may wish to see." From his coat pocket he withdrew a small photograph. The missing photograph. Clara Morton sat upon a Brighton promenade holding a small child upon her lap. Beside her stood a young Leonard Graves, smiling, unashamed, for one brief captured instant untouched by fear. Miss Marple accepted the photograph gently. "How did you find it?" Mistress Graves kept it hidden. Miss Marple's eyes rested sadly upon the image. Even Margaret Graves, despite everything, had preserved it. Not from hatred, perhaps, but because part of her understood exactly what had been destroyed. Stephen said quietly, "You pity her." Miss Marple looked up. "Yes." "She killed 2 people." Stephen frowned slightly. "I'm not certain I understand you, Miss Marple." "My dear boy," she said softly, "understanding people and approving of them are entirely different things." After he left, Miss Marple remained alone for some time. The photograph rested upon her lap beside abandoned knitting. Outside, late afternoon sunlight spread gold across the village gardens. Children's voices drifted faintly from the lane. Ordinary life again. Always ordinary life. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts lingered upon Margaret Graves, not because she excused murder, she never did, but because she recognized the pattern. Quiet women ignored too long, pain hidden politely, resentment stitched carefully beneath daily duties until eventually they poisoned everything around them. Rather like the sewing basket itself, beautiful externally, dark things concealed within. Several days later Inspector Finch called for tea. The inspector appeared considerably more relaxed than at any point during the investigation. "I've submitted my final report," he announced. "And how does it read?" "Badly," said Finch honestly. "Every time I think it sounds sensible I reread it and discover hidden errors, accidental poisonings, and 30-year-old drownings." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, real life rarely arranges itself neatly for reports." Finch accepted a second scone. "You were right about one thing especially." "Only one?" He grunted. "The sewing basket." Miss Marple looked amused. "I'm delighted it satisfied you at last." "No, I mean symbolically." The inspector shifted awkwardly, clearly unaccustomed to discussing symbolism. "Everything important was hidden there because nobody considered it important." Miss Marple nodded quietly. Finch looked thoughtful. "Strange, really." "Not strange at all," said Miss Marple. "Human beings always hide dangerous things among ordinary ones. It makes them feel safer." The inspector finished his tea. Then he paused at the door before leaving. "You know," he said slowly, "there's one thing still troubling me." "What is that?" "If Evelyn had simply left Willowbrook immediately, none of this might have happened." Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "No," she said softly, "I do not think that is true." Finch frowned. "Why not?" Miss Marple looked toward the fading autumn roses outside her window. "Because secrets do not remain buried forever, Inspector. They grow heavier underground." That evening the church bells rang peacefully across Willowbrook. At Hawthorne Lodge, servants closed curtains against the cold. At Briar Cottage, empty rooms gathered dust and silence. And at Rosebank Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat beside her fire knitting steadily while shadows lengthened softly around the room. The mystery had ended, but its lessons remained. Because beneath every quiet village, every respectable family, every ordinary life, there were hidden compartments where people tucked away fear, shame, love, and sorrow. Most remained undiscovered. Some did not. And Miss Marple, with her patient eyes and gentle understanding of human nature, knew perhaps better than anyone that the darkest shadows were rarely found in lonely places. They lived instead inside perfectly ordinary hearts. Winter arrived slowly upon Willowbrook. The last roses blackened beneath frost. Bare branches rattled softly in the lanes. Smoke curled from cottage chimneys into pale gray skies that darkened before tea-time. And gradually, as winter deepened, the village began the ancient human process of turning tragedy into memory. Not forgetting. Villagers never truly forgot anything, but softening. Edges blurred. Shock faded. Conversation shifted cautiously toward newer concerns: influenza, rationing rumors, the vicar's leaking roof, Mrs. Bellamy's alarming Christmas puddings. Even Hawthorne Lodge recovered some appearance of dignity. Colonel Penrith dismissed 2 servants, sold a portion of neglected land, and abandoned forever his ambitious plans for restoring the East Wing. Financial reality, though unpleasant, possessed certain clarifying virtues. Lavinia devoted herself to village charities with renewed energy, and Briar Cottage stood empty beneath drifting snow. Miss Marple observed all this quietly from Rosebank Cottage while continuing her knitting with admirable consistency. A few days before Christmas she received an unexpected parcel. Inside lay the old sewing basket. No note accompanied it except a small card in Stephen Armitage's handwriting. "I think perhaps you understand it better than anyone else." Miss Marple sat for some time looking thoughtfully at the basket resting upon her lap. It appeared harmless still. Dark woven willow. Faded silk lining. Slightly worn handles polished smooth by long-dead hands. An ordinary domestic object. And yet within its entire lives had been hidden murder. Miss Marple touched the frayed edge of the lining gently. Human beings, she reflected, always underestimated small things. A careless sentence, a hidden letter, a teacup, a sewing basket. Such objects altered destinies more often than grand dramatic events ever did. That afternoon Mrs. Carter arrived carrying holly branches and village news. "My dear Jane, I have just seen Mrs. Bellamy buying 6 tins of preserved cherries." During winter, Miss Marple murmured suitable astonishment. Mrs. Carter settled herself comfortably. I suppose this Christmas will feel strange after everything. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. And poor Lavinia still looks so fragile. She has carried unhappiness a very long time. Mrs. Carter nodded sadly. Though perhaps it is better now that everything is known. Miss Marple threaded red wool carefully through her needles. Truth generally improves the air eventually, she observed. Mrs. Carter glanced toward the sewing basket upon the side table. You kept it. I confess, Mrs. Carter said with a small shiver, I should never wish such a thing in my house after all that happened. Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear... Mrs. Carter considered this uncertainly. I suppose not. The danger lay in what people concealed. Snow began falling shortly after dusk. Large soft flakes drifted past the cottage windows while the fire glowed warmly inside. Mrs. Carter departed reluctantly through the whitening lane, and Miss Marple remained alone. For a time she simply listened to the quiet. Winter silence differed from ordinary silence. It softened the world, muted it, allowed memory to rise more easily. Miss Marple's eyes rested upon the sewing basket again. Then, quite unexpectedly, she rose, crossed the room, and lifted it carefully onto her lap. Inside remained only harmless sewing things now. Embroidery scissors. Yet as she touched them she thought suddenly of Clara Morton, a frightened young woman sewing patiently beside a fire somewhere long ago, perhaps hoping life might still become kinder, and of Margaret Graves, quiet, dutiful Margaret, stitching resentment invisibly through decades of silence until it finally poisoned everything around her. Miss Marple sighed softly. So many tragedies, she thought, began with loneliness. The following Sunday Willowbrook gathered for the Christmas service beneath candlelight and evergreen garlands. The church glowed warmly against the snow outside. Voices rose together in familiar hymns. Children fidgeted. Elderly men coughed discreetly. And for the first time in many months the village felt peaceful again. Miss Marple sat beside Mrs. Carter near the back. As the choir sang Silent Night, her gaze wandered quietly across the congregation. Colonel Penrith stood with bowed head. Lavinia sang softly beside him. Inspector Finch, visiting from Much Benham, looked deeply uncomfortable during hymns, but determinedly respectful. Ordinary people all. Weak sometimes, kind sometimes, dangerous occasionally. Human always. Miss Marple believed profoundly in human nature precisely because she recognized how fragile goodness could be. After the service, villagers lingered outside beneath softly falling snow, exchanging greetings and Christmas wishes. Mrs. Bellamy declared the weather positively Dickensian. Major Fanshawe nearly slipped upon the church steps. Children chased one another through drifts despite parental protests. Life continued. It always did. Later that evening, Miss Marple returned home alone. Rosebank Cottage felt especially warm after the cold night air. She removed her gloves carefully and sat beside the fire with the sewing basket once more near at hand. For several moments she simply watched the flames. Then she smiled faintly to herself. Because despite everything, murder, grief, concealed scandals, broken lives, Willowbrook remained fundamentally unchanged. Human beings would continue falling in love unwisely, protecting secrets foolishly, hurting one another accidentally, forgiving imperfectly, and carrying hidden sorrows inside ordinary-looking lives, rather like stitches beneath fabric, invisible unless examined closely. Miss Marple reached for her knitting at last. Outside, snow settled softly over the sleeping village. Inside, the firelight flickered warmly across the old sewing basket resting quietly in the corner, its shadows no longer frightening, only human. By the time spring returned to Willowbrook, the worst of winter's heaviness had begun to lift from the village. Snowdrops appeared first beside hedgerows and church walls. Then crocuses pushed cautiously through damp earth, followed by daffodils nodding brightly in cottage gardens as though nothing tragic had ever happened anywhere at all. Miss Marple always found spring slightly impertinent in that way. Human beings mourned for months. Nature rarely bothered beyond a season. Still, the returning warmth brought visible relief to Willowbrook. Windows reopened. Carpets appeared draped over hedges for beating. Chickens resumed their invasions of respectable gardens, and slowly, almost shyly, laughter returned. One April afternoon Miss Marple walked to the churchyard carrying primroses for Clara Morton's grave. The grave itself had been newly marked only weeks earlier. For many years Clara had lain anonymously in Brighton beneath a modest stone arranged quietly by the parish authorities after her death. But Stephen Armitage, before leaving England, had insisted upon bringing her remains back to Willowbrook, not to Hawthorn Lodge, not near the Penrith family plot, but beneath the old yew tree behind the church. Miss Marple approved of the choice. Clara Morton had belonged to the village long before the village failed her. As Miss Marple arranged the flowers carefully beside the stone, she heard footsteps approaching softly behind her. Lavinia Penrith. The younger woman carried violets in her gloved hands. For a moment neither spoke. Then Lavinia said quietly, "I come here often now." Miss Marple nodded. "Yeah, I think perhaps I owe her that." The spring breeze stirred faintly through the churchyard grass. Lavinia stared down at the grave. "My mother feared disgrace more than unhappiness. It destroyed everyone eventually." Miss Marple folded her hands over her walking-stick. "That was common in her generation." "And yours?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear, every generation fears different things while making exactly the same mistakes." Lavinia gave a faint laugh. Then, after a silence, "Do you believe people truly change?" Miss Marple considered. "Occasionally, that sounds discouraging." "Not necessarily. Small changes matter enormously." She adjusted the primroses slightly. "Human beings improve one kindness at a time, not all at once." Lavinia looked thoughtfully at her. "You make everything sound simpler than it is." "Oh, no," said Miss Marple. "Merely more familiar. That same week Briar Cottage was finally sold. The new owners, a cheerful retired schoolmaster and his wife from Surrey, arrived with energetic optimism and entirely unsuitable tweed hats. The village approved of them immediately. People preferred fresh beginnings after unpleasant histories. Mrs. Carter visited Rosebank Cottage bursting with excitement. "My dear Jane, the new people are repainting everything." "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly. "And apparently they intend keeping chickens. That may alarm the Roses." Mrs. Carter leaned forward conspiratorially. "Do you think they know what happened there?" "Oh, certainly." "And they still bought it?" Miss Marple smiled. "Houses are very rarely guilty, Elspeth." Mrs. Carter reflected upon this with visible uncertainty. A few days later Inspector Finch called unexpectedly during one of Willowbrook's first genuinely warm afternoons. The inspector appeared in unusually good spirits. "I was passing nearby," he explained, accepting tea and seed cake with suspicious readiness. "My dear Inspector," said Miss Marple, "policemen never merely pass nearby." Finch grinned reluctantly. "Perhaps not." They sat in the garden where bees drifted lazily among tulips. For a while they discussed ordinary village matters. Then Finch said thoughtfully, "You know, the Graves case continues troubling younger officers." "Oh?" "They dislike the accidental elements." Miss Marple nodded. "People prefer murder tidy. The poison especially." Inspector Finch frowned. "A planned murder feels comprehensible. But unintended death leading to panic and further killing," he shook his head. "It unsettles them." Miss Marple looked toward the bright spring borders. "Because it is more truthful." Finch considered this quietly. "You really believe most terrible things begin accidentally?"
Oh, yes.
Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "One selfish decision, one concealed truth, one frightened moment." She sighed softly. "Human catastrophe is usually untidy." The inspector stirred his tea thoughtfully. "And yet you still seem fond of people." Miss Marple looked genuinely surprised. "My dear Inspector, how could one understand human beings without becoming fond of them occasionally?" Finch laughed aloud. "Even murderers?" Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "Not fond exactly, but compassionate perhaps." After a pause she added softly, "Most wickedness comes from weakness rather than evil." Later that evening Miss Marple opened the sewing-basket once more. Not from suspicion now, from habit. The basket had become oddly comforting in recent months. A reminder, perhaps, or warning. Inside lay her own sewing things, now mixed gently among the older contents. Fresh thread beside faded thread, present beside past. As she sorted silks carefully into small bundles, her fingers brushed against something tucked deep within the lining. Miss Marple paused, then slowly withdrew a folded scrap of paper she had somehow overlooked before. Her eyes widened slightly. It was old. Very old, and written in Clara Morton's hand. Only one sentence appeared. "People forgive sorrow more easily than truth." Miss Marple sat perfectly still. Then, after a long moment, she smiled sadly. Because Clara Morton, frightened village girl though she had been, had understood human nature extremely well. That Sunday afternoon Miss Marple carried the note with her to the cedar grove near the lake. Spring sunlight flickered through new leaves overhead. The water no longer appeared sinister, just peaceful. Children from the village occasionally played nearby now. The world moved forward. Miss Marple sat quietly upon the old wooden bench where Margaret Graves had finally surrendered months earlier. Then she read Clara's sentence once more. People forgive sorrow more easily than truth. That explained nearly everything. Lady Penrith concealed the truth. Dr. Graves concealed the truth. Margaret Graves killed to preserve a life built upon concealment. And Evelyn Harbury died because she insisted upon uncovering reality rather than accepting comfortable lies. Miss Marple folded the paper carefully. Truth, she reflected, demanded courage from everyone involved. Far more courage than most people possessed. Yet despite everything, she still believed truth mattered. Not because it prevented suffering. It rarely did. But because without truth, sorrow simply deepened underground until eventually it poisoned lives quietly from within. Rather like water beneath frozen earth, or shadows hidden inside harmless things, the lake shimmered gently beneath afternoon sunlight. Miss Marple rose at last and began walking slowly home through the lane lined with hawthorn blossom. And behind her, beneath the trees, the cedar grove stood peaceful at last. Summer returned to Willowbrook almost unnoticed. One morning the hedgerows were merely green. The next they overflowed with wild roses, buzzing bees, and children escaping sensible supervision. The village fete committee resumed activity with alarming determination despite memories of the previous year. Human beings, Miss Marple often reflected, possessed extraordinary talent for repeating circumstances they claimed to regret. Mrs. Bellamy declared firmly that abandoning the fete would mean allowing tragedy to triumph, though Miss Marple privately suspected she simply enjoyed organizing cake competitions. And so Willowbrook prepared once again for bunting, brass music, sponge cakes, and carefully restrained village rivalry. Life insisting upon itself. On a warm June afternoon, Miss Marple sat beneath the apple tree at Rosebank Cottage, repairing a tear in one of her cardigans. The old sewing basket rested beside her chair. It had become part of the cottage naturally now, as though it had always belonged there. Inspector Finch, visiting during one of his increasingly frequent unofficial calls, watched her sew with faint amusement. "You know," he remarked, "most people would have thrown that thing into a bonfire after everything attached to it." Miss Marple threaded her needle calmly. "That would have been extremely unfair to the basket." Finch laughed. "You remain remarkably consistent?" "My dear Inspector, objects are innocent. It is people who become complicated." The inspector stretched comfortably in the garden chair opposite. "You sound almost affectionate toward humanity again." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I generally recover after murder cases eventually." After a pause, Finch said, "The Graves matter has been finalized." "Yes?" "Margaret Graves pleaded guilty." Miss Marple's hands slowed slightly upon the cardigan. "How is she?" The inspector hesitated. Miss Marple nodded. That somehow seemed inevitable. A soft breeze stirred the garden flowers. Finch watched Miss Marple sewing for a moment before speaking again. "There's one thing I never asked." "Oh? Why did Evelyn Harbury interest..." "One thing I never asked." "Oh? Why did Evelyn Harbury interest you immediately?" Miss Marple considered. "Because she behaved like someone trying to appear fearless, and she wasn't. No one truly fearless keeps looking over their shoulder." The inspector frowned thoughtfully. "You noticed that at the fete?" Miss Marple tied off a stitch carefully. She watched doorways constantly, and she touched the sewing basket several times without realizing it. Finch shook his head slowly. "I still cannot understand how you notice such things." Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. "My dear Inspector, village women notice everything. Most simply choose not to think about what they notice." Preparations for the new fete occupied Willowbrook for weeks. This time the event would take place upon the vicarage lawn rather than at Hawthorn Lodge. Mrs. Bellamy considered this tactful. Colonel Penrith considered it insulting. The village considered it sensible. Miss Marple attended several planning meetings during which she observed with quiet satisfaction that ordinary irritations had fully resumed. People argued over flower arrangements, over raffle tickets, over whether Major Fanshawe ought to be permitted near the lemonade after the unfortunate incident of 1948. Normality. Perhaps the greatest blessing human beings possessed. On the morning of the fete itself, sunlight poured warmly across Willowbrook. Children raced through the lanes, carrying ribbons and toy boats. Church bells rang cheerfully overhead. Miss Marple arrived early, carrying a Victoria sponge and wearing pale blue. Mrs. Carter greeted her happily. "My dear Jane, doesn't this feel better than last year?" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "much better." Yet as she walked slowly across the crowded lawn, she found herself remembering another summer afternoon, another fete, another woman standing near roses pretending not to be afraid. Human memory layered itself strangely over places. For a moment Miss Marple could almost hear Evelyn Harbury laughing nearby. Then the brass band struck a spectacularly incorrect note, and the illusion vanished instantly. Later in the afternoon Miss Marple slipped quietly away from the fete for a short rest beneath the churchyard yew tree. Clara Morton's grave lay nearby, bright with fresh flowers, not forgotten after all. Miss Marple sat upon the bench thoughtfully. The case had ended months ago. Justice, in its imperfect human form, had been done. Yet some sadness remained unavoidable, because beneath the mystery itself lay something simpler and far older. Loneliness. Clara lonely in Brighton, Margaret Graves lonely within marriage, Evelyn lonely even among admirers. So many lives twisted quietly by silence and fear. Miss Marple sighed softly. People spoke constantly about love, she thought. Yet very few understood the courage required for honesty. "Miss Marple?" She looked up. Lavinia Penrith stood nearby carrying a basket of raffle tickets. The younger woman smiled now more easily than before. "You escaped too?" "Briefly." Lavinia sat beside her beneath the yew branches. For several moments they watched children running across the distant church lawn. Then Lavinia said quietly, "I sold Hawthorne Lodge's east wing furniture yesterday." Miss Marple nodded. It felt strangely relieving. "My dear, unnecessary burdens usually are." Lavinia smiled faintly. "I spent years preserving appearances for people already dead, and nearly destroyed my own life doing it." Miss Marple adjusted her gloves gently. "Many women of your generation were taught that duty mattered more than happiness. And yours?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled softly. "My generation simply concealed unhappiness more elegantly." Lavinia laughed unexpectedly. The sound seemed wonderfully healthy. After a silence she said, "Do you think Mother was wicked?" Miss Marple looked toward Clara Morton's grave before answering. "No." "Even after what happened?" Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. "I think she was frightened, proud, and selfish at moments, which describes a great many respectable people." Lavinia considered this for some time. Then slowly, "That sounds almost merciful." "No," said Miss Marple gently, "only accurate." As evening approached, the fete wound gradually toward conclusion. The brass band packed instruments. Children slept upon picnic rugs. Mrs. Bellamy announced triumphantly that the sponge cake competition had achieved an unprecedented standard of excellence. And beneath lanterns beginning to glow softly in the dusk, Willowbrook looked peaceful once more. Miss Marple walked home slowly through lanes fragrant with summer roses. At Rosebank Cottage she paused before entering and glanced back toward the distant village lights. So many lives, so many hidden sorrows stitched invisibly beneath ordinary existence. Yet perhaps that was why small kindnesses mattered so deeply. A cup of tea, a patient conversation, a truth spoken gently instead of concealed. Tiny stitches holding fragile human lives together. Inside the cottage the old sewing basket waited beside her chair. Miss Marple touched it lightly as she passed. Then she settled peacefully beside the fire with her knitting while summer darkness gathered softly beyond the windows. And in Willowbrook at last the shadows had begun to fade. By late summer Willowbrook had settled fully back into itself. The murder of Evelyn Harbury no longer dominated every conversation, though traces of it lingered quietly in certain places in lowered voices near Hawthorne Lodge, in the occasional glance toward the cedar grove, in the way older villagers paused briefly when Clara Morton's name was mentioned. But life, persistent as ivy, had climbed over sorrow once again. The roses bloomed. The church bells rang faithfully every Sunday. Children forgot tragedies much faster than adults and resumed racing through village lanes with noisy certainty that the world existed entirely for their amusement. Miss Marple approved of this immensely. One warm evening she sat in her garden with the sewing basket beside her chair and a pale lavender shawl growing steadily beneath her needles. The sunset spread gold across the cottages of Willowbrook. Mrs. Carter arrived through the gate carrying pears. "My dear Jane, the vicar insists this year's harvest supper must be especially cheerful after everything that happened." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Human beings always become energetic about celebration after sorrow. Mrs. Carter settled herself comfortably. "I suppose we must all move on eventually." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "though moving on and forgetting are very different things." Mrs. Carter looked toward the sewing-basket. "You still keep that dreadful object." "My dear Elspeth," Miss Marple replied gently, "it has become quite useful." Mrs. Carter shook her head. "I could never look at it without imagining poison and secrets." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled slightly. "That is because you possess an imaginative disposition." "And you do not?" "Oh, no," said Miss Marple. "I simply prefer reality." Several days later, Miss Marple received a letter from Stephen Armitage. The envelope bore an address in Canada. She opened it slowly beside the fire. "Dear Miss Marple, I thought you might like to know that I have accepted a teaching post in Montreal. It is strange beginning life again at my age, but perhaps strange beginnings are sometimes necessary. I often think about my mother now with less anger than before. That is partly because of you. You once said that understanding people is different from approving of them. I believe I understand that now. I hope Willowbrook is peaceful again. Yours sincerely, Stephen Armitage." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. Then she placed it inside the sewing-basket beneath her knitting wool. Not hidden, simply kept. There was a difference. Autumn arrived gently afterward. Leaves drifted across the village green. Smoke scented the evening air. And one rainy afternoon Inspector Finch appeared once more at Rosebank Cottage, damp from weather and faintly irritated by mud. "You know," he remarked while removing his coat, "I passed the cedar grove earlier." "Yes? I realized something rather odd." Miss Marple poured tea. "What was that?" "For months I avoided the place entirely." Finch accepted his cup thoughtfully. "Today it looked perfectly ordinary." Miss Marple smiled. "Places are rarely evil, Inspector. Only memories attached to them." Finch sat near the fire. "I suppose that is true." After a pause he added, "You never told me one thing." "Oh! Why did Evelyn Harbury fascinate you so much personally?" Miss Marple considered before answering. "Because she reminded me of many clever young women I have known." "How?" "She mistook uncovering truth for immunity from danger." Finch frowned slightly. "I'm not certain I follow." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Intelligent people often believe understanding human wickedness protects them from it. Unfortunately, it merely allows them to recognize it sooner." The inspector stared thoughtfully into his tea. "That sounds rather sad." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly, "but true." That evening after Finch departed, Miss Marple sat alone beside the fire while rain tapped softly against the cottage windows. The sewing-basket rested beside her chair. At last she lifted it gently onto her lap. Inside lay ordinary things only. Fragments of memory. No shadows remained now except those belonging naturally to the past. Miss Marple touched the faded silk lining thoughtfully. How strange, she reflected, that such terrible suffering had emerged from something designed merely for mending, and yet perhaps that too made sense. Human beings spent their lives attempting repairs, repairing reputations, repairing hearts, repairing old mistakes with new allies until everything tangled together beyond separation. But occasionally, rarely, truth allowed something genuine to heal at last. Outside, the rain softened gradually into silence. Willowbrook slept peacefully beneath the autumn dark, and Miss Jane Marple, with her patient understanding of human weakness and kindness alike, resumed her knitting quietly beside the fire. The shawl of pale lavender wool lengthened stitch by stitch beneath her careful hands, very like life itself, slowly repaired, carefully mended, and never entirely free of hidden threads.